Hello and welcome to Listen Up Landlords with Ben Beadle and me, Richard Blanco. As we settle into life without Section 21, landlords and property professionals are familiarising themselves with Section 8 grounds for possession. The Renters' Rights Act has heralded some completely new grounds, whilst others have been amended. Some grounds like breach of contract and antisocial behaviour have always been notoriously difficult to evidence and get a possession order. Under the Renters' Rights Act, establishing intention on the new selling ground could cause frustration going forwards. Whilst the vast majority of tenancies are ended by the tenant, the inability of landlords to use Section 21 may now lead to long court proceedings where the landlord wishes to seek possession. Well, we'll speak to solicitor Carly German about some of the challenges. Training Officer Hannah Kenyon will join us for a briefing on calls you've been making to the NRLA advice line, with understanding the new assured periodic tenancy one of the hot topics. But first, the government wants common hold to replace the centuries-old system of leasehold for all new build properties. Existing leaseholders will have new rights to extend their lease, buy their freehold, or convert to common hold. The Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Bill was one of 37 bills featured in the King's Speech. 3.8 million residential leaseholders have a ground rent obligation in England and Wales, and the bill will see these capped at £250 for the next 40 years. The bill will also see the abolition of forfeiture and remove draconian rights to enforce maintenance charges, according to the government. So, Ben, many leaseholders resent the fact that they have to pay big fees to get permission for, say, a loft extension or to extend their lease. But then freeholders bought freehold investments in expectation of a long-term return. And of course, pension funds have invested an estimated 15 billion in this sector. So you need to see both sides of the argument in many ways, don't you?
And therein lay government's problem. I think the government's challenge is that almost everybody agrees leasehold is unpopular, good and bad as you describe, Richard, but actually replacing it without destabilizing the housing market, pension investments, and apartment development is a completely different matter. And I think that is why it's taking so long, because the issues are very, very complex, and there are some very strong arguments both for and against.
Yeah, let's be honest. The biggest leaseholder gripe is fees levied by managing agents. So we'll talk to our guests about that. Do you think that this bill is going to go some way to sorting that out?
Well, I think it has to, if government is to realise a key manifesto pledge. And certainly, Pennycook has been very, very firm about his desire to want to deal with this issue. But of course, it's very tricky. And, you mentioned how you deal with ground rents, but enforcement is another unresolved issue as well. The abolition of forfeiture sounds politically attractive, a bit like removing Section 21. But, it removes the threat of someone losing their home over relatively small amounts of money. But of course, you still do need an effective mechanism to ensure that service charges are paid so buildings can still function. And these are really, really finely balanced issues that government is working through, but certainly taking their time.
And leaseholders would argue that abolishing leasehold is simply a matter of bringing property ownership into the 21st century, and freeholders have just got to stomach it.
Well, they do, but as ever, it's not quite as easy as that, is it? It really isn't. And if we're looking at the alternative, government is with common hold, for example, potentially requiring residents to take an even greater collective responsibility to managing buildings. Well, we all know how difficult that can be. It only takes one idiot, frankly, in a block to cock it up for everybody else. And these are real everyday issues that we're going to have to contend with, and that government is going to have to contend with.
It's such a good point, Ben. And I know of lots of people where there've been 5 or 6 in a share of freehold. They're all leaseholders, but one person is so difficult that nothing ever gets decided. And let's hope that that's not what the future holds for all of us with common hold. Well, look, let's bring in our guests. Many landlords are freeholders, so NRLA Policy Director Chris Norris joins us. But we'll begin with Roger Southam, who's former chair of the Leasehold Advisory Service. Roger, welcome. Thanks for coming onto the podcast. Can you explain why the government favours common hold and how it's different from leasehold?
We wouldn't start from where we are, I guess, would be one of the things. So there's been a campaign for a number of years for leasehold to be abolished because it's the most evil thing on the planet and all the poor tenants are treated abysmally and it's feudal and it's horrendous and it's horrible. And common hold is the most wonderful panacea to solve everybody's problems. So common hold is equivalent to condominium in the US, to strata in Caribbean, etc. So it's basically everybody has a share in the title as opposed to having the original structure in the UK of landlord tenant. Now that can be a long lease, it can be a short lease, but for the long leasehold structure, you've obviously got an out of kilter structure where the freeholder is having more say than necessarily their value is worth. So if you've got a leasehold apartment in a big building and you've got 999 years, you're effectively holding virtual freehold. So the value is the majority of the building, but the freeholder can still dictate in terms of ground rent, in terms of running, etc. So that's where it's considered a bad thing. I've never thought leasehold is necessarily bad, and I get criticized mercilessly for this. I've been vilified through the House of Commons, and I've been vilified through Private Eye, God bless them. But it's not the structure that's the problem. It's the attitude of the freeholder or the attitude of the leaseholder that causes the issue. Some people are not meant to live in communal living. So it's a question of how do you get people jointly sharing responsibility? My biggest worry with the way we're heading is that you're going to have some very, very, very complex buildings that we've had various initiatives of having communal heating systems, of having district heating systems. The technology that is in some of these buildings is insanely complicated. And you're going to have the new common hold structure where people won't know what they're doing. They need to make sure it's all maintained properly or those buildings will grind to a halt.
Yes, because of course decision by committee is not always the best way to run things, is it?
Well, I've always thought a committee should be an odd number and 3 is too many. So right. Trust me, when you get to common hold and you get to these sorts of things, to have people debate. I mean, I've been managing property for 47, 48 years now. I've seen everything. And my goodness, you can see some nightmares.
And it's no wonder, of course, that lenders are quite worried about common hold and have got some anxieties about it. Let's move on to another slightly different topic. What will happen to existing leaseholders? If you could just tell us briefly on that, Roger.
Well, the devil's in the detail, and obviously all we've got is the 5 lines or whatever it was in the King's speech of what is proposed for a bill. So in terms of how they actually plan to do this, we're not going to know until something's drafted and something's put out and it passes through the House of Commons. But I believe the intention is that they will grandfather across the leases into common hold. Now, how are you going to compensate the freeholders? Because you made a very valid point in the introduction about the pension funds and the investors. There's a couple of points I'll come back to that if I may, but so the leaseholders would turn into common hold. They would have a share in the title and they would then be picking up the pot of money that's sitting in the service charge or the reserve fund, and they'll be taking on the responsibilities for the running. So it's this kind of Peter Pan waving his magic wand and suddenly everything is perfect.
And it's 4.8 million, just under 4.8 million leaseholds in England and Wales. It's a lot, isn't it? Let me just ask you about fleecehold, this term fleecehold, Roger. What is meant by it and what are the issues that it involves?
Right. So fleasehold was an expression that was coined. I can't remember who originally coined it, but I know it sort of relates into some of the lobby groups and some of the MPs and some of the nicer militant anti-leasehold people who thought it was a catchy little term to say that every leasehold has been ripped off unmercilessly by their managing agent and their freeholders. So it's kind of this fleecing of the property, fleecing of the service charge. Now, I have to say, there are some terrible landlords out there. I've had a case going on for 4 years trying to get the freehold, which is an as of right under the Act, the 96 Act, I think it is, to go through. And we've got the freehold for a group of leaseholders. It's registering at land registry as we speak. The freeholder still hasn't accepted he hasn't got the freehold and is still making claims, is a vexation. So you get some terrible people, but it doesn't mean they're all terrible.
Indeed. Chris, maybe I can bring you in here and thinking about, the issue of complaints. How do freeholders respond to concerns about unregulated ground rents and unjustified fees?
Well, I think as Roger was saying, the problem here is people. If we get people out of the system, we're probably all right. Some freeholders, some management companies, they respond very well and very professionally, and everyone's quite happy. And in those cases, leasehold is a perfectly viable, adequate system. In other cases, you've got an absentee freeholder, you've got a management company that's not responsive, you've got people not meeting their current duties and obligations, and that's what leads to a lot of this call for reform, which I do think actually is necessary in one way or another. But I think Roger again used the right term. It's complex. We're trying to deal with an enormous number of properties, leaseholds at the moment, a grand total, I think, of 20 common hold properties at the moment in the last 24 years of common hold being in existence. So it's going to take a lot of grappling with a lot of different kinds of people and bringing them on board. And as you said before, Ben, having some kind of backstop and enforcement that sits behind it, because ultimately we are going to be dealing with human nature.
Indeed. Then, the proposal to cap ground rents at £250 for 40 years, do we think that's reasonable in the circumstances?
I think it's one of those areas where it's very difficult to put together a fully justified counter proposal. I think it's quite difficult as someone, if you particularly have not been a very responsive freeholder, let's say, to push back and say, well, actually, I've earned my money and here I can justify that I've earned X or it's cost me Y and therefore I should be entitled to charge more. So I suspect that the government, that is, have stumbled across a reasonable compromise there. Now, I say that as someone who doesn't own any freeholds and doesn't collect any ground rent. I'm sure there's quite a big cohort of people out there who are looking at this, and quite a lot of institutional investors who are looking at this and thinking this is going to be a major hit to our revenue streams. What the government and any government, frankly, looking at this is going to be doing is balancing out what are we talking about, 4.8 million leaseholds. Let's say they've got 2 leaseholders per leasehold dwelling unit, each of whom has got a vote versus the freeholders. So I think there's a political decision to be made there, and I think that's why they probably stumbled across that compromise. But the devil will be in the detail. We've seen a draft bill, and that goes through some of the kind of intricacies of what they want to do. We've not seen the full bill yet. And anyone who's been following this, and I feel sorry for you if you have been following it in detail for the last 25 or 30 years, knows that just because legislation gets passed doesn't mean a great deal ever has to happen. I mean, we've had the Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act in 2002. We've had the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act. About 20 years later, we had the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act in 24. And we've still not seen most of that implemented. So, I will wait with bated breath to see if we get these things through Parliament and then enacted before we have a general election. I wouldn't, if you are a leaseholder hoping for some protections or for some great changes, hold my breath too much. Because there will be a lot of moving parts before this actually becomes a reality.
Indeed. And one of the very thorny issues, Chris, is that some funds rely very heavily on these types of investments in terms of the ground rent that is derived. What sort of funds could be affected? I noticed that even the church has been brought up on occasion.
let's not get me started on the holdings the church has. That could don't want to get our podcast cancelled. I mean, there's a whole variety there. I mean, if there's a saving grace to this, actually, UK pension funds have been really poor at investing in UK stock, UK property. So maybe we're not quite as exposed there as we would otherwise be. I'm sure Roger has a better understanding of exactly what's invested in there. One of the details we need to see, though, is what kind of compensation will exist. So I think if the draft bill follows through into the actual bill and an act that's implemented, I'm not sure at the moment they're talking about an automatic grandfathering or an automatic conversion. I mean, they're talking about reducing the threshold for people who are currently leaseholders but will be common holders voting for conversion. So I suspect we wouldn't see an overnight transition from leasehold en masse to common hold. I think there'll be a lot of complications in doing that, and a lot of people who are currently leaseholders who don't really want to take on all of that responsibility. We've seen a mixed bag with right to manage, for instance, which is not dissimilar to the kind of changes we'll see. But I'm sure there will be a lot of pressure to make sure there is adequate compensation to those funds, because we don't want to see pension funds getting hit by a change, no matter how politically popular that change might be.
Chris, the government wants to replace forfeiture with a fairer system. How do freeholders feel about this?
I imagine they're not enormously happy, but I think it's actually one of those areas where, I don't know if there are current stats about how often forfeiture is an issue for blocks, let's say, to put it in the simplest terms. It is at the moment, arguably, too easy to use a relatively minor issue, a relatively minor set of arrears to forfeit a long lease. So I think even within the freehold community, I would imagine that there is some kind of acceptance that needs to be amended. Again, when we see the detail of the bill, I think we'll see quite how up in arms people will be about what levers are left for them and what kind of enforcement strategies they'll have in the future. I'd be quite surprised if all of the tools available to freeholders are removed, or if we don't see a few new tools introduced to make sure that their income and their rights, I suppose, are maintained. But I think even most freeholders would have to acknowledge that the way that forfeiture can be used at the moment isn't necessarily proportionate.
And Roger, like me, you mentioned some of the complexities around actually the new world and people effectively self-managing and things like that. But isn't it true to say that flat owners will need training and qualifications to manage the blocks effectively themselves?
Logically, they will. I mean, I don't know quite how you enforce that or you require that, but for a simple apartment building that has no air conditioning, no district heating system, no central heating, no communal heating system, the lifts, the fire requirements, all the bits that got enacted as a result of Grenfell, and quite rightly, that is an industry in its own right. Now, these are the things that people complain about, of recurring charges and increasing charges without fully understanding why they're there or what's happening. And it's kind of be careful what you wish for, because you're just introducing a whole new complexity and layer for people who at the end of the day should be volunteers. And who in their right mind is going to volunteer? I mean, I know that ARMA, as was, the Property Institute as is now, used to have training for directors of resident management companies, right to manage companies, resident management companies. And the responsibilities that people are taking on as a director were enormous. And whether people really have their eyes open on what they're doing is the big conundrum. Can I just pick up on a couple of points from Chris, though, because it's interesting.
Briefly,
the 250 ground rent, I agree with fully, because the developers and the house builders lost sight of what they were doing. They were building homes for people and they were selling the homes. They suddenly hit on the great initiative. They could sell the freeholds with rising ground rents and have no comprehension of what they were causing or creating as a down-the-line issue. That is where the problem starts from. And it's all escalated off the back of that. It's just greed, really.
And what's your best guess around what happens next in a time frame then, Roger, because the housing minister has warned the new common hold framework won't be in place until the next parliament. So what's your best guess?
I mean, Chris hit the nail on the head perfectly when he said the last act hasn't been enacted fully. They brought it through Parliament and haven't enacted it. There is enough rules, regulations, and powers within the acts that exist for people to protect themselves if they have the right advice. I've just dealt with the freehold over 4 years of a horrible man who's a vexatious litigant. We have achieved that in excess of it, or quicker than lawyers were dealing with it, because the lawyers were taking their apologies, Carly, but the lawyers were taking their myopic view of this is how we deal with it. Whereas I, with 48 years, was going outside the box and thinking, how do I tackle this problem with this person, and going obliquely. And we went down the county court route as opposed to the tribunal route, and we've achieved success way quicker than the lawyers have done for similar blocks this guy owns. Now, he's a nightmare freeholder. The facts of government saying this is what's going to happen. So I think we could be sitting here in another 5 years still having the same debate over whether this is the right thing, the wrong thing, etc. It's just one of those things that is jingoistic. It's popular. It's the right thing to do for sure. But no one is ever going to actually man up and say, right, let's put it in, because of the pension funds and the refunds that are going to have to be done. Who's stomaching paying for those?
And on that wonderful note, we shall say thank you very much to Roger Southam and Chris Norris. Many thanks both for joining us. Fascinating discussion.
Well, we welcome back Hannah Kenyon, who is NRLA training officer and works closely with the NRLA advice line. There has been a lot to take in over the last few weeks, Hannah. Earlier, you were telling me that landlords have a lot of questions about what an assured periodic tenancy is and how it actually works. So tell us a bit more about it.
Thanks, Richard. There's definitely been a lot of panic about what an assured periodic tenancy is, an APT. I think a lot of people are thinking it's a whole new thing. They've got to learn a whole new thing from scratch. Essentially, it's the same agreement as it was before, but just minus the elements around duration and fixed term and an end date. So all of the clauses, the tenant's obligations, the landlord's obligations, the day-to-day management of the tenancy doesn't fundamentally change. It's just it doesn't have an end. And I think a lot of people are sort of getting themselves into a bit of a pickle, about having to issue brand new contracts and having to put all these different clauses in, when we've said to them, we have these contracts you can use. We've got one for joint tenancies. We've got one specifically for students that include that ground 4A clause that they need to evict students in the future if they need to. HMOs for room only, we have an abundance. Our policy team have been very, very busy creating all of these documents for them. So it's just advising and guiding them into that direction, that it's not a panic. It's just having to just relearn a few bits and pieces.
And Hannah, how are landlords adjusting to the deadline for existing tenancies with the tenant information leaflet? Are we getting lots of calls around that?
Lots of calls, I think I had a few people that were asking, I've sent them the link, and it specifically says don't send the link. Yes, even my own, I've had a few people close to me that have sent things. I'm like, no, it's not the link, it's the actual document. I think, given that we had a bit of time and it came out quite early, but back in March, I think it was, people have had a lot of preparation. But I think a lot of them are, understanding that actually, it doesn't actually mean they have to issue a brand new contract. It just converts what they already have. And when you explain it in a very sort of basic way, it sinks in, and they go, I can just let it carry on, issue this document, and carry on, whatever I need to do. So, yeah, I think hopefully, after the 31st of May, we might have some calls probably of people panicking that they haven't served it. But the majority of people are, once they understand the process, they get it and they go send it.
I guess that's the confusion, isn't it, Hannah, that your existing contract just automatically converts into an APT, this new assured periodic tenancy. What's been the most surprising element for landlords? Is it that they can't have a fixed term anymore, or I'm curious about that.
I think a lot of people, we've had quite a few calls of people saying, I'm looking to serve a Section 21. And we're like, well, you can't. Well, why not? Well, There's a little thing called the Renters' Rights Act that just, no one really knows about. It's just come in. So there's still a few people that have sort of missed that big announcement, the changes over the last 18 months. I think it's more the concern, we've had a lot of calls where people are saying, oh, well, I can never get my property back. Well, that's not true. There are 36, 37 grounds in total that, they've expanded on a lot of them. They've changed some of them. They've added a load more grounds. So it's not a case of they can't get possession. It's just they have to give a reason. It's arrears and social behaviour. They're selling. That was the main reason a lot of people use Section 21 notices, is because they were selling. There is now a sale ground. Yes, there are some restrictions, but as long as you don't misuse it, you can still get possession back if that's the way that your year's plan, 5-year plan is going. I think it's just understanding that they can do it, just they have to give a reason and they have to give a ground now.
And Hannah, are we getting any landlords reporting that tenants have immediately used the sort of 2-month notice at the earliest opportunity?
Not as many as I think I thought there would be. There's been mainly a lot of people asking for pets. That's been a big trigger, is, I can have a pet. I would like a pet request. Not so much notice as much as I think we all thought that would kick in. It might sort of change moving forward, but I think now people know that they can stay on a little bit longer. They're looking at pets. That's the main, I think, from the change, the main question that's coming up.
And of course, our members in Wales also need to issue a variation document by the 14th of June, I think, for existing tenancies. So that's another date in the diary to adhere to. Yeah,
there's so many dates. I feel like every I've got a calendar on my laptop of just all these different dates. I need to remember which one's happening and when. I think as long as people don't.
I was going to say, important not to miss them.
It's regulation heaven, isn't it? Yes.
Oh, it's brilliant. I can't wait.
Well, very happy to have you there looking after everything, Hannah. Thank you so much, and to your colleagues on the advice line for all of the sterling work that they are doing. We'll see you again next month.
Thank you.
Well, as Hannah was saying, where landlords wish to take possession of their property, they must now use Section 8. Some grounds are new, some have changed, and some are fairly unfamiliar to landlords, as previously they were likely to use Section 21 as an alternative. Now, Carly German, who is a property dispute solicitor and CEO of Woodstock Solicitors, joins us. Thanks so much for joining us, Carly. And let's go through some of the grounds that are most relevant to the private rented sector. We're going to try and spend a couple of minutes on each one. I know it's a bit of a rush, but let's see if we can get through some. So first of all, this all-important ground 1. This is where a landlord or close family member wants to move in. What constitutes a close family member?
Yeah, so it's a civil partner, parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, siblings. So, close family, not extended family. And I think that may be the trap that people will fall into and start to look at nephews and cousins. Critically, it does include a step and half siblings and relations. So I think that's important to note. And I'm glad that's included. But yeah, that's the concern, I think, where people will start to stretch this one a little with not having Section 21 and use this one to, stretch what is considered a close family member.
That's interesting, isn't it, actually, Collie? Because with HMOs, cousins are included, so it's slightly different there. And if the tenant doesn't leave after the 4 months' notice, presumably the landlord has to issue court proceedings. Would there always be a court hearing?
Yeah, and that's the key thing with this new legislation is the requirement for a court hearing, which is one of our biggest concerns because of the ability of the courts to deal with the volume of hearings that are going to need to go through. But yes, if the tenant doesn't leave, then a court hearing will be required to obtain your order for possession.
Right, and this is what really makes this very different from Section 21, isn't it? So coming on to ground 1A then, which is on selling the property. Question here, if the tenant was in the property before the 1st of May 2026, when does that 12-month qualifying period start? Is it from when the last AST began?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation around this one. And I think, what's really important to note is that this is new legislation and it's the courts are going to be grappling with this. It's, there's elements of it that are open to interpretation, and there's bits that are not clear. But my understanding is that it starts from the last renewal or from the start of the tenancy. But I think it's one before you're issuing this notice or you're issuing proceedings to stop and pause, find out what's going on in the ground, on the ground with the county courts and see how they're applying it. That's the really important thing to do with all of these new grounds that we're relying on, seeing how the courts are interpreting, what evidence they want to see, and any issues that are cropping up.
Gosh, yes, so it's a moving feast in many ways, isn't it, Carly?
Keeps it
I
fun.
wanted, yes, I wanted to ask, if the tenant later gives 2 months' notice after you've given your 4 months' notice, will that override the landlord's notice and cancel the need for that 12-month letting ban that we have, once the tenant leaves?
No, it doesn't. And I can see why they've done this. Otherwise, you would just, people would just be using it as a bit of a tactic, and encouraging, tenants to go. And then they think, well, I can relet it now. So no, they can't.
Right.
So they have to be really committed to their course of action, essentially.
And this issue of the landlord's intention to sell came up in a previous podcast. Are we likely to see the landlord having to prove their intention to sell for this ground to really work?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be going to court without some firm evidence that you've signed up with, your agency, it's on Rightmove, all of that. I think it's really important. You don't want to give a judge any reason in a 15-minute hearing to say, I don't think you've established this ground. Let's adjourn and come back. So it's really important. I think just be belt and braces. It's new law. Judges are grappling with new law. Make it easy for them. You have to present everything to them. 15 minutes is all you've got.
And in the spirit of making things easy, Carly, the student ground, which isn't easy at all. So
Yeah.
it does seem to be very complex, let's say. What issues do you see arising on the use of ground 4A, where 4 months has to be given between the 1st of June and the 30th of September, where there's a blue moon and a pig flying, I think is the precise reasoning.
Yeah, and it's a really tight window, isn't it, operationally, for landlords to comply with. And also, lots of tenants may have left by then. It's that uncertainty. Are they staying for next year? It's all shifting. New people are moving in and out. It's really complex. And also the requirement to make sure that the tenancy agreement stipulates that you're going to rely on this ground as well. As long as your tenancy agreement's well drafted, you should be fine. But it's a really tight window. So really, you need to be serving that notice ASAP at the beginning of June for it to take effect, so that you don't mess up the cyclical nature of what students lets. It's incredibly frustrating ground.
And of course, that is where the landlord believes all tenants are students. Yes. So you could believe that they're all students, but potentially something has happened during the tenancy to negate that. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't like to risk it and just go in front of a judge and say, look, I just believe, but I didn't make any inquiries. I think courts are going to expect landlords to be making inquiries and to do regular visits and check the status of their tenants. And I think if you don't do that, a judge will say you've not, done your due diligence. How could you possibly believe or have any reason to believe they're still students? This could change, very quickly. Also, some courses are shorter as well, when others, the course, the academic year, shorter courses versus. So I think, if I was a landlord, I'd be writing to them regularly and making sure the tenancy agreement again stipulates that they have to notify you of any changes, but also making those inspections and writing to them to seek clarification.
And of course, that transition period requires the landlord to notify the tenant for existing tenancies of their intention that they might be relying on a student ground. So that's something they should be doing.
Yep.
100%. And ground 6, where we're talking about redevelopment, that's suitably vague. How do you see this playing out, and what do you think would meet the test of redevelopment? Because it's presumably not just sticking a new bathroom in, is it?
No. And I think, it is vague, isn't it? And I think this is again going to be quite an interesting area. I think things like, new bathroom, even, potentially works to a kitchen, electrics, all of that sort of thing. It's not what's inconvenient for the tenant or inconvenient for the trades or inconvenient for the landlord. It has to be that they couldn't possibly remain in the building while you're doing these works. So I think, it has to be quite substantial.
And there could well be a wonderful colliding of policies here, couldn't there, with ground 6 and MEs conspiring together, where work is required to bring it up to a C that actually is so extensive that it requires possession to be taken back, potentially.
Yeah. And for me, what I'd be expected to see is, quotes from tradespeople and whoever's going to carry out the work to say they require vacant possession to be able to sensibly carry out the work. And perhaps, if you can possibly seek some sort of agreement with the tenant beforehand as well.
Indeed. And ground 8, rattling through them now, but applies to rent arrears extended from 2 to 3 months. The ground can't be used if the arrears are caused by unpaid benefits. I mean, diabolical, but that's what it says. So the tenant can still pay rent at the last minute. What other issues do you see practically playing out in courts along these lines?
Yeah, just to pick up on what you said there, again, that's where I'd be advising landlords to be writing to their tenants and doing that due diligence to say, look, I've asked the question, here's the letter, I've routinely asked it, and also specifically required them to notify me if there are any issues or they believe they may be entitled to a housing benefit. And when you serve a notice, giving them places to go and get support to see whether they are actually entitled. So, that's that issue. But I think, we've always had an issue with ground 8 and meeting that 2 months prior to the Renters' Rights Act, at the time of serving notice and at the hearing. You've just kind of made it easier for tenants to do the age-old trick of just chipping away and keeping it just below that threshold so that you don't get that order for possession. So what I expect to see, I think, is more suspended orders. So that's an order where they say, look, you've got a period of time to bring the arrears up to date, or an order will be made, which, sometimes tenants comply with, sometimes it works, and it stabilizes a tenancy. But I think we will see lots of, just prior to the hearing, they're just below that threshold, which will be really frustrating to landlords. And the amount of time as well, it's the clock ticking, isn't it? The courts are slow. They've got an extra month, and we're going to be waiting for the courts to list these hearings. So if they're, doubling around under that 3-month threshold and you've got more delays, it'll be very frustrating for landlords.
Under ground 12, which constitutes breach of tenancy, how high is the bar here, Carly? I mean, for example, could subletting fall into this category? And I'm wondering what kind of evidence is needed. A colleague of mine had let a house to 4 tenants and discovered that they'd sublet it to 10 people recently. Now, luckily, they could use Section 21 because it happened before the 30th of April deadline. But I'm presuming that now they would have to go with ground 12, would they?
Yeah, it'd be ground 12, and ground 12's not a ground. We've always sort of thrown it in with the others, if I'm completely honest. That's how we've used it, because it is discretionary. So it's a tricky one. And I think, again, it's all about the evidence and the best evidence you can possibly get. And I think subletting is one where you'd be able to use that. But it's making sure and looking at the impact on others around you. Courts are going to be more persuaded to make an order for possession if it's not just a little bit inconvenient or difficult for the landlord, but you're in a leasehold block. There's overcrowding. There's concern about the activity that's going on with that subletting as well. So what landlords are going to have to do is really work with their agents, or, if they're work, self-managing, that they gather that picture of evidence. They're going on to Rightmove, they're going on to all the other places where they may sublet. I've forgotten the name of the forums, but gathering all of that so they can quickly show to a land judge that they have to be ordering possession on that date.
And Carly, one of the things many landlords are worried about with Section 21 going is that it was very effective for dealing with antisocial behaviour because the court process was so difficult. Now we've got ground 14. It's a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably one of my biggest concerns about this legislation. I think about it a lot and think, how else could they have dealt with it? And you
should get out more, Carly. You should get out more, please.
I should. And it is really tricky, isn't it? And it's difficult to gather the evidence. It's difficult to, get people to come to court. What happens if they go to court, they give evidence against their neighbour and that order's not made? it's, you know, relying on a judge's discretion. What one judge may consider antisocial may be completely acceptable to another. It's very, very open to interpretation, which is why Section 21 has been a brilliant tool for antisocial behaviour, because we have very rarely gone on anything other than a Section 21 because of the, you know, the amount of evidence you need to gather and the risk attached to it. So it is really frustrating. And my advice would be to work very closely with the local authority, look at closure orders, look at injunctions, because if you can couple them with that, it gives you the power to persuade a judge. I've done it before. We've worked with the local authority to get a closure order. I supported them in their application. I then got support for my application following. So it does work. It depends on how great a relationship you have with a local authority, what the landlord liaison officers are like, you know, and that becomes really, really important to deal with antisocial behaviour. And it should be the effort that everybody puts in, because it can only be dealt with effectively if you all collaborate.
And on those closure orders, they're very quick, actually, once you get them into the Mags Court. As you probably know, I sit as a magistrate, so I deal with quite a lot of these things. But isn't it the case that only social housing providers can make that application, or can private landlords too?
Well, I've only ever done it with a local authority applies for a closure order, and we've just worked in collaboration with them, and then we've then gone and obtained possession.
Well, might be something for us to pick up here. Carly, absolutely fascinating. Key takeaway, really, you can't just stick a notice in the post and hope for the best. You've got to really manage this process right the way through, do your due diligence, keep your records, and really manage it right the way from start to finish. Fantastic discussion, Carly. Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of this edition of Listen Up Landlords.
There is plenty of information on all the topics we have discussed today on the NRLA website.
And do keep in touch with us on social media. All that remains to say is thank you to our producer, Sally Walmsley, and to you for listening.